A young boy named Aang and his friends enter the spirit world in search of answers to help save a dying land. Before going too far, they meet a giant owl that tells them to be careful because there are strange creatures in the spirit world that can cause them pain. They don't seem to understand this until a strange monster appears in front of them and creates a fog, with the aim of capturing their souls and ensuring they don't return to the land of the living. Many years earlier, the leader of a tribe called the Fire Nation Sozin decides to launch a major attack on a neighboring nation of people called the Air Nomads, because they have the next avatar. For many years, the avatar has been a hero who exists to bring balance and maintain peace between the 4 nations in the world, which include the Fire Nation, Air Nomads, Earth Kingdom, and Water Tribe. With the next avatar expected to be from the Air Nomads, Sozin believes it's best to kill them all so that no one can stop the Fire Nation from ruling the world. Elsewhere, a boy named Aang plays around while his mates are training with the Air Nomads. His mentor, Gyatso, eventually calls him to ask why he's not training. Aang says he already knows all the moves they're teaching, but Gyatso mentions that even though Aang's airbending moves are more advanced than the other kids, he still needs to take his classes seriously. Following this, he tells Aang to join the other kids in preparing for a comet festival that will see all the Air Nomads meet up in the same place for the first time in 100 years. As Aang leaves, one of Gyatso's colleagues tells him that he's needed at a council meeting. There, Gyatso is asked why he hasn't told Aang that he's the Avatar. Gyatso says Aang is still too young, but the council members believe he should already be mastering the elements from the other nations. They tell Gyatso to immediately inform Aang and let him leave as soon as possible. Shortly after, Gyatso brings Aang into the temple of the last airbending avatar named Yangchen. Gyatso then mentions that after Yangchen, the next avatars were Kuruk from the Water Tribe, Kyoshi from the Earth Kingdom, and Roku from the Fire Nation. He adds that this means the next avatar will be an airbender. As Aang looks confused, Gyatso informs him that he's the avatar. He also mentions that Aang needs to leave so he can start learning the other elements. Aang looks unhappy because he feels he's too young to have such a big responsibility, but Gyatso encourages him and says he's sure Aang will make a good avatar. Later that night, Aang decides to go out for a while with his flying bison named Appa so he can clear his head. As he leaves, Sozin arrives and launches a severe attack on the Air Nomads. The Airbenders try their best to fight back, but Sozin and his men torch the whole nation and kill everyone, including Gyatso. Elsewhere, Aang also gets caught up in a storm. Before he can get back home, the storm gets serious and throws him and Appa into the ocean. 100 years later, a boy named Sokka and his sister Katara are out fishing near their home in the Southern Water Tribe. The world has been at war since Sozin's era, and the other nations have been facing the consequences of a war against the Fire Nation under the new leadership of a man named Ozai. While Sokka and Katara's mom was killed by Fire Nation soldiers, their dad left them so he could fight in the war. Before he left, though, he put Sokka in charge of protecting the tribe. Katara also turns out to be the last waterbender in her village, though she's still learning about it secretly to avoid getting caught by Fire Nation soldiers. While they're fishing, they eventually come across a giant ball of ice. Before they know what's going on, the giant ice ball starts causing the ground to shake as it's about to break. Suddenly, the ice shatters, and Aang appears to be inside with his tattoos glowing and a beaming light directed toward the sky. Coincidentally, a prince from the Fire Nation named Zuko is nearby with his soldiers, and he sees it. Zuko has been banished from the Fire Nation by Ozai until he finds the Avatar, so he looks relieved to finally find his target. He immediately informs his uncle Iroh, but the old man doesn't think it's possible to find the Avatar. However, Zuko sounds sure and says he needs to find the Avatar so that he can go home and claim his rightful place as the heir to the throne. Meanwhile, Aang passes out after the lights in his tattoo stop glowing. Katara then suggests taking him back to their village. When they get there, their grandmother, Gran, looks shocked to see Aang because he looks like an airbender. However, Sokka says it's impossible because there have been no airbenders for many years. They eventually decide to wait until Aang wakes up. When he does, Aang plays with the kids in the village, and as he asks for Appa, his flying bison suddenly shows up. Shortly after, he then explains how he got lost. As he mentions the Comet Festival, Gran looks shocked and tells him that it has been 100 years since it happened. As she also mentions how Sozin wiped out the air nomads, Aang can't believe this, so he runs outside. Gran then tells Sokka and Katara that even though Aang looks like a boy, he's much more than that. Katara then goes outside to console Aang. She also tells him about how the Fire Nation raided her village and killed almost everyone. After a while, she shows him that she's the last waterbender in the Southern Water Tribe. As she struggles with her powers, Aang teaches her how to maintain balance, and she does it well. Shortly after, Zuko and his men arrive at the Southern Water Tribe. Sokka is shocked by this, and as he wonders why Zuko came to his village, Gran tells him and Katara that the prince came for Aang. She also adds that he's the Avatar, and this leaves them shocked. Zuko then announces that he'll leave if they give up Aang. However, Sokka challenges him to a duel to get him to leave. Zuko accepts and beats up Sokka, but just as he's about to kill him, Aang shows up and defends him. He then agrees to follow Zuko as long as he doesn't hurt anyone in the village. Following this, Aang follows Zuko and his men back to their ship. Immediately they leave though, Zuko and Katara decide to help Aang, so they also head out using Appa. While in custody, Iroh goes to meet Aang and expresses his shock at seeing the Avatar. After answering some of Aang's questions about the extent of the Fire Nation's war, Iroh leaves while saying he hopes to have more conversations with the Avatar. Just then, Aang steals the keys to his cell and escapes. He eventually enters Zuko's room and sees a notebook in which Zuko has written a lot of things about the Avatar. Aang thinks it could be useful, so he takes it. However, as he's about to escape, the soldiers see him and Zuko also tries to stop him. Luckily, Appa arrives with Katara and Sokka, and Aang is able to escape. He thanks them for helping him, but as they ask where they should go next since they can't go home again, Aang suggests going to see what his home looks like. When they get there, he sees that everything they said was true. As he then walks around, he sees a burnt body with a necklace similar to the one Gyatso always wore. This gets Aang angry, and his tattoos suddenly start to glow again. This also causes him to start destroying the things around him, so Sokka and Katara quickly find a place to hide. However, he eventually calms down after remembering when Gyatso said he'd make a great avatar. After this, Sokka asks about Aang's tattoo glow, but Aang says he doesn't know what it is. He then mentions that after seeing what the Fire Nation did to his people, he's ready to take his role as the Avatar seriously. After a while, Aang checks Zuko's book and discovers an Earth Kingdom stronghold named Kyoshi Island nearby. Since it's also where Avatar Kyoshi used to live, Aang decides to go there next. Before they leave, Aang sees something moving inside Katara's bag. It then turns out to be a winged lemur named Momo. Katara also checks the bag and sees a scroll, which is a waterbending training manual. There is also a letter from Gran telling Katara to learn all it takes to be a waterbender. Elsewhere, Zuko discovers that his notebook is missing. He gets angry and starts scattering his cabin, but Iroh is able to calm him. After a while, they stop at a Fire Nation stronghold to get information to help find the Avatar. Since Zuko prefers to tell no one about the Avatar just yet, he and Iroh decide to lie about what they're looking for. Shortly after, they meet a commander named Zhao, who looks pleased to welcome the prince to the Fire Nation base. Zuko and Iroh then ask for maps and other things that can help them monitor the area. Zhao asks what it's for, and Iroh says they're hunting for shark squids. Zhao suspects something, but he agrees to give them what they want on the next day. However, as they leave, he tells one of his men to find out what they're really looking for. Later that day, Zhao eventually learns that Zuko has found the Avatar. Zhao then realizes that the Avatar must be in the area, so instead of helping Zuko, he decides to find Aang himself. Meanwhile, Aang arrives at Kyoshi Island with Katara and Sokka. As they stand before Kyoshi's statue, they suddenly get attacked by Kyoshi warriors led by a girl named Suki. Aang immediately mentions that he's the Avatar, but Suki doesn't believe him. However, Kyoshi's statue suddenly shines a bright light on Aang, and this leaves Suki shocked. She then takes Aang to meet her mom, who is the leader of the village. When they get there, the woman mentions that they can't accommodate Aang and his friends because it could easily attract the Fire Nation to the village. As Aang then tells her that he's trying to learn how to stop the war and bring peace to the world, she agrees to let him and his friends stay for only 2 days. The next day, Zuko discovers that Zhao has found out about the Avatar. He looks disappointed by this, but as he hears that Zhao went to Kyoshi Island after hearing reports of an airbender being there, Iroh says they can follow him. Elsewhere, Aang and Katara start looking through all the notes the Kyoshi warriors gave them. From what they can find, they learn about the Avatar state, which is what happens when Aang's tattoo starts glowing. Katara also finds a book where she reads that all the spirits of the previous avatars are inside Aang. Katara then advises him to find a way to connect with them. Following this, Aang heads back to Kyoshi's statue and tries his best to contact her. Luckily, he eventually enters the Avatar state and meets Kyoshi in another realm. Just then, Katara notices that the Fire Nation has arrived. Zuko and his men also reach the island, but instead of confronting the villagers, they immediately head towards Kyoshi's statue. Katara sees this and decides to stop them from finding Aang. Meanwhile, Zhao and his men approach Suki and her mom to ask about Aang. The Kyoshi warriors deny knowing anything about the Avatar, but as Zhao insists that they'll search the village, a battle starts. Elsewhere, Aang asks Kyoshi about being the Avatar, and she says he has to be a warrior. She also tells him that the Avatar state allows him to channel the strengths of previous avatars inside him. Aang says he's scared that he might hurt someone, and this gets Kyoshi angry as she mentions that his absence for 100 years has already gotten many people killed. She then shows him a vision of a great battle that will happen at the Northern Water Tribe. She says that if he doesn't do anything, more people will die, even on the island. As Aang then realizes that the island is under attack, Kyoshi says she'll show him the true power of the Avatar. Following this, she takes control of his body and enters the Avatar state. Just as Zuko is about to beat up Katara, Kyoshi lands and leaves him shocked. Before he can do anything though, she attacks him and eventually goes around the island to kill most of Zhao's men. Zhao immediately tells the survivors to retreat, and as they do so, Kyoshi leaves Aang's body. As he then says he has somewhere to be, all the villagers bow to him as a sign of respect for the Avatar. Aang then leaves with Sokka and Katara to head to the Northern Water Tribe. Elsewhere, Zuko complains about Zhao's involvement in the mission. However, Zhao says he can be useful in finding the Avatar. Even though Zuko also prefers for it to be a secret, Zhao believes they'll be able to achieve so much more if he tells Ozai. Following this, Zhao writes a letter to Ozai to inform him that Zuko has found the Avatar. Ozai looks pleased about this, and he tells his daughter Azula. However, she doesn't look happy because she believes Zuko will return one day and ruin her plans of becoming the heir to the throne. Meanwhile, on their way to the Northern Water Tribe, Aang sees someone flying near an Earth Kingdom stronghold called Omashu. He then decides to make a stop because he thinks it's another airbender. As he, Katara, and Sokka get to the gate, they realize that the guards are killing strangers and preventing them from entering the city. Luckily, a boy named Jet offers to help by giving them robes to disguise themselves and enter the city. After a while, Aang eventually discovers that the boy flying around, Teo, was only using a flying device. Almost immediately, an explosion happens in a nearby building, but Aang and Katara use their powers to kill the fire and save Teo. His dad, Sai, also comes out and leads Aang and the others to his house. There, Teo mentions that the Fire Nation spies in the city have been causing the explosions. Following this, Aang decides to wait in Omashu to help fight the spies before leaving for the Northern Water Tribe. Teo then mentions that he has a clue about where the bombers might be hiding. Aang decides to follow him there while the others wait behind. After a while, Katara sees Sai speaking to a Fire Nation spy, but before she can do anything, Jet stops her. He then tells her that Sai has been secretly working for the Fire Nation. As the spy leaves, Jet and Katara follow him. He eventually realizes that someone is following him, so he attacks them with his other firebenders. However, Jet also calls on his friends who help defeat the spies. He then takes Katara to where he and his friends hang out. There, he also tells her that they're freedom fighters who are going after the Fire Nation to get revenge for all the people they've lost. Meanwhile, Aang and Teo find the suspected hideout of the bombers. As they look around, Aang sees Jet's robes and realizes that the spies are not behind the bombings. Elsewhere, Zhao informs Zuko and Iroh that one of his spies has informed him that there's an airbender in Omashu. With this, they then decide to head over there. After a while, Azula also tries to get the upper hand in the battle for the throne, so she sends a letter to Zhao to give her all the information she needs regarding the Avatar and Zuko's efforts. She adds that she'll do him a huge favor if he's loyal to her. Meanwhile, Aang immediately returns to tell Sokka that Jet is the bomber. Coincidentally, Katara also arrives and tells them that Sai is behind the bombings. Sokka doesn't believe her, and they eventually fight over who could be right. Katara then leaves angrily to find Jet. Unknowingly, Zuko is already around, and he sees her. As she then meets Jet, he says he's already working on a mission to bomb the palace in Omashu. He says he has planted a bomb in Sai's box, just as he's about to show some machine designs to the king. Katara discovers that he's the one behind the bombings, but he says it's because there are spies in the palace. Katara doesn't care, and she leaves to tell Aang and the others. Following this, they immediately head to the palace, but Zuko suddenly stops them. Aang then tells Katara and Sokka to stop the bomb while he handles Zuko. As they're fighting, Zuko avoids using his firebending so that he doesn't alert the soldiers. However, Aang suddenly gets him pissed, so he shows his powers. The guards immediately start looking for him, but before they can catch up, Iroh decides to sacrifice himself and pretend to be the wanted firebender so that Zuko can leave. Elsewhere, Katara stops the bombing with her powers and looks relieved because innocent people could have died. As Aang is also about to look for them, the Earth Kingdom soldiers arrest him. He is then taken to a prison where he discovers that Iroh is also an inmate. Meanwhile, Sokka and Katara blame Sai for helping the Fire Nation. Teo also accuses his father of being a bad person, but Sai says he only agreed to help because they promised to spare his life. Sokka and Katara then tell him to take them to the palace so they can find Aang. He says he can't, but Teo then mentions an old tunnel leading inside the palace, so Sokka and Katara agree to leave. While Katara is outside, Jet shows up and expresses his disappointment at her for stopping the bombing. She doesn't seem interested in what he has to say, but as she tries to walk away, he holds her back. She then has to use her improved waterbending skills to cover him in ice. Following this, she and Sokka leave for the tunnels. Later on, the Earth Warriors show up to take Iroh away. Aang asks where they're taking him, and Iroh says it's to a pit where he'll be killed. Aang feels sorry for him, but he's also told that the king has asked to see him. When he gets there, the king turns out to be a really old man who says he knows Aang as not only an airbender, but also the Avatar. As he also talks about what Aang likes, the Avatar realizes that the king is his old friend, Bumi. Aang asks how Bumi is still alive, and he says he has been taking care of himself very well. He also looks shocked to see Aang looking so small. Aang says it's a long story, and Bumi then tells his men to throw his old friend a feast. After this, Bumi then puts Aang through a series of dangerous tests, as he seems angry that the Avatar wasn't around when the world needed him. Elsewhere, Zuko manages to enter the palace to find his uncle, but he learns that Iroh is already on his way to the pit. Meanwhile, one of the Earth Kingdom soldiers starts torturing Iroh on the way to the pit. The soldier says Iroh was responsible for the death of his brother when he led a siege in an Earth Kingdom stronghold called Ba Sing Se. He almost kills Iroh, but his men stop him, after which he says the former Fire Nation general doesn't know what loss means. However, he's unaware that Iroh also lost his son during the siege. After a while, Zuko finds Iroh and saves him from the Earth Warriors, even though he sustains some injury. Meanwhile, Bumi takes Aang to a hall where he says the next challenge is for them to fight. Aang doesn't like this, but Bumi continues to talk about how disgusted he is to hear that Aang slept through a war in which he had to make tough decisions as king. After a while, he forces a big rock to drop on Aang, but the Avatar keeps it from falling. Bumi also drops one over his own head, but Aang still struggles to save him. As he gets weaker and almost drops one of the rocks, Sokka and Katara show up and stop Bumi from hurting Aang. Following this, Bumi says he was only teaching Aang a vital lesson about how he can't always save everyone. Aang then says that he's now ready to take his role seriously. Before Aang and his friends leave, Bumi says Omashu will soon be under attack from Fire Nation forces. However, he tells Aang that he can still leave because Omashu will be ready for them. He also mentions that he got information about the attack from a source who turns out to be Sai. Sokka and Katara look happy for him, and after a while, they leave with Aang. While on the move, they find a burnt forest and stop there. As they look around, they eventually find a nearby village where a man reveals to them that the Fire Nation was responsible for burning the forest. He also mentions that it has made their land weaker. The man adds that some fellow villagers went on an expedition to find food, but they've not returned. As Aang looks shocked, the man says whatever is happening seems beyond the world. Aang suddenly feels strange and realizes that something is really going on in the land. He then tells the man that he'll try to get back his people. After walking away, Aang tells Sokka and Katara that he feels the lost villagers are in the spirit world. They're shocked to hear this, but Aang says that as the Avatar, he's able to feel when something is wrong because of his connection to the spirit world. As he keeps walking, he sees a shrine for the spirit of the forest. He then sits and starts trying to get to the spirit world. Just as he manages to do it, he also brings Sokka and Katara with him. While moving around, they see a giant owl speaking to Aang. The owl mentions that while Aang is allowed into the spirit world, Sokka and Katara don't belong there. He also says that the longer they stay, the more dangerous it becomes. Aang asks for more details, and the owl says there are creatures in the spirit world that can cause pain by making people see the truth. Aang then asks about the missing villagers, and the owl directs him to meet someone inside a hut on the mountain. After the owl flies away, Aang tells his friends what the creature said. Before they can go any further, though, another creature tries to attack them. They manage to survive, but eventually get lost in a fog. As Sokka looks around, he sees a talking fox that sounds friendly to him. After a while, Sokka says he needs to leave to find his friends. However, he again gets lost in a past memory where his dad tells someone about his disappointment in Sokka. Just then, a monster named Ko appears and snatches him. Elsewhere, Katara gets lost in the memory of when her mother died. After she sees it happen again, Ko appears and takes her away. Aang also sees his old home but knows it's not real, so he walks away. Ko then shows up and praises Aang for resisting his trap. He also says he knows Aang is the Avatar because one of his past incarnations tried to kill him. Aang doesn't know what he's talking about, but Ko also asks if he's there to return what he stole. Aang still doesn't get this, so he asks for the villagers. However, Ko says he can't give them up because he always eats his victims. Just then, Aang runs away and finds the hut on the mountain. As he goes in, he sees Gyatso, but thinks it's not real. However, Gyatso proves that he's real, and he tells Aang that after he died, he came to settle in the spirit world because he knew the Avatar would need him one day. Suddenly, Aang remembers that Sokka and Katara are still lost in the fog. Gyatso says it's the fog of lost souls, and that they might already be with Ko. Aang asks how he can defeat the monster, but Gyatso says it's impossible because other avatars could never do it. Aang then remembers Ko mentioning that one of the past avatars almost killed him. Gyatso says it's Roku, so Aang says he'll go to his temple to contact him. Gyatso thinks it's dangerous because it's in the Fire Nation, but Aang says he still has to go. As he's then about to leave, Gyatso tells Aang never to blame himself for the death of the air nomads because he couldn't have possibly saved all of them. Following this, Aang leaves for Roku's temple. Elsewhere, Zuko and Iroh watch a bounty hunter named June paralyze her target with her pet monster. Iroh seems impressed, so he hires her to find Aang. Meanwhile, Azula gets Ozai to send some supplies to Zhao for doing a good job of finding the Avatar. Even though he accepts, Ozai corrects her and says Zuko did the impossible and found the Avatar. As he also mentions that it's what he expects from his heir, Azula looks angry. The next day, Aang arrives at Roku's temple, but as he enters, the priests attack him even though they know he's the Avatar. As Aang is running away, he gets dragged by a priest named Shu, who offers to help him. He then takes Aang to Roku's statue. When they get there, Shu explains that the other priests believe that Ozai is the real leader they should be following. As Aang then has to contact Roku, Shu goes outside to stop the other priests from coming in. Shortly after, Aang gets in contact with Roku, who sounds quite jovial. After begging for Roku's help to save his friends from Ko, the old Avatar gives up a totem he stole from the monster. He also tells Aang to use it to bargain for his friends, because the totem means a lot to the monster. Following this, Aang heads back to the human world, but after looking around he sees that the priests have been paralyzed. As he doesn't understand how it's possible, June shows up and also paralyzes Aang. She then delivers him to Zuko and Iroh, who eventually take Aang away. As they keep going, Aang begs Zuko to let him save his friends. However, Zuko rejects the request. Aang can't believe this, and he sounds curious about what must have happened to make Zuko so cold. Just then, Zuko remembers how he complained about his father's plans to sacrifice some soldiers to gain some advantage in the war. Ozai then gets angry and challenges his son to a fight that ends with the prince getting a scar and being banished until he finds the Avatar. In the present day, Zhao suddenly shows up and says he wants to take Aang into custody. Zuko is not happy about this, but because Ozai has already put Zhao in charge of all operations regarding the Avatar, he lets the commander have his way. Shortly after, Aang is imprisoned at a nearby Fire Nation stronghold. There, Zhao looks happy and celebrates with his men. Later that night, a masked man enters the Fire Nation base and kills some guards before saving Aang. As they're about to leave, though, Zhao and his men find out about their escape attempts. Before he can do anything, the masked man threatens to kill Aang, so Zhao lets him leave. However, he eventually gets an archer to shoot the masked man, who then passes out. As this happens, Aang opens the mask and sees that Zuko saved him. He then helps Zuko to hide before Zhao's soldiers show up. They eventually stay in a nearby hut, but as Zuko wakes up, Aang asks why he's not on the same side as Zhao. Zuko says he just wants to take Aang home to get his life back and become the heir to the throne. Zuko still tries to get violent, but Aang stops him and gets a boat for him to leave. Zuko then returns to his ship to meet Iroh, who has been worried about him. Elsewhere, Aang also makes the trade with Ko, after which all the villagers are released along with Sokka and Katara. From there, they then continue their journey to the Northern Water Tribe. After a while, they finally get there and are welcomed quite well by the tribe's leader, Arnook, and the senior waterbending master, Pakku. Aang immediately tells them about his vision, but they mention that they already know what's coming. Elsewhere, one of Zuko's men hears Zhao telling one of his men that they'll soon kill him for committing treason. With this, Iroh advises Zuko to leave immediately, but it turns out that Zhao has put blasting jelly in the small boat. Before Zuko goes too far, the boat then explodes, leaving Iroh shocked. Much later, Zhao shares his condolences with Iroh. After talking about Zuko's death, Zhao then tells Iroh that Ozai has instructed him to lead an army to attack the Northern Water Tribe. Meanwhile, Katara meets with Pakku and asks when she can begin her training, so he directs her to a woman named Yogoda. However, when Katara meets Yogoda, it turns out she's only a healer. Katara asks when she'll start learning different fighting techniques, but Yogoda says that women are not allowed to fight in the war. This leaves Katara disappointed, so she decides to complain to Pakku. Elsewhere, Sokka sees the tribe's princess and spiritual leader Yue and feels like they've met before. After talking for a while, Sokka sees her headband and realizes that it's the same one the fox in the spirit world was wearing. However, he says nothing. With the Fire Nation getting closer, Arnook and Pakku ask Aang how he plans to help them. Aang says he hasn't mastered the other elements yet, so Arnook and Pakku realize that the Avatar won't really be helpful. Shortly after, Aang gets Yue to take him to the statue of Avatar Kuruk. Yue says Kuruk was a weird avatar because he didn't do his job and was mostly away in the spirit world. Aang then decides to contact him. When they finally meet, Aang asks for his help with the war and tells him to take control of his body like Kyoshi did, but Kuruk says he can't. He then mentions that he spent his life fighting spirit warriors who wanted to invade the human world. He adds that he can't control the Avatar state because his spirit has been corrupted. Kuruk also mentions that Aang will have to bear the burden alone. While Aang is speaking to Kuruk, Sokka joins Yue inside the temple. There, she then confesses that she was the fox. Sokka asks how she could do it, and she says that when she was young, the moon spirit saved her from dying by bestowing her with a part of him. She then says it's why she can go into the spirit world sometimes. Aang finally gets back to the human world and tells Yue that Kuruk can't help. Meanwhile, Katara meets Pakku to complain about the rules preventing women from fighting. Pakku says he can't change it, but Katara then challenges him into a fight to show what she can do. Even though he ends up beating her, she shows how good she is, and everyone who watches the fight commends her. Aang then says he's scared of his friends fighting in the war, but Sokka and Katara promise to stay with him until the end. Elsewhere, it turns out that Zuko escaped the explosion and is now on his ship. Iroh knows about it, and they're also aware that Zhao was the one who tried to kill the prince. As they get closer to the Northern Water Tribe, Zuko leaves the ship to find the Avatar first. After a while, Iroh asks for Zhao's plans, and the commander says he plans to kill the moon spirit because it's the one that gives the water tribe the power of waterbending. Iroh can believe this, but Zhao adds that his research has shown him that once a year, the moon and ocean spirits always come to the water tribe to take a different form. Iroh thinks it's a bad move, but Zhao doesn't care. Back in the Fire Nation, Azula gets tired of Ozai's frequent tests of fighting new warriors every day. She believes she's already good enough to take on something big, and she shows Ozai by channeling her ability to fight with lightning. At the Northern Water Tribe, Aang and the others start fighting Zhao's soldiers. Pakku also gets Katara and the other women to join the fight. Meanwhile, Arnuk tells Yue to hide in the temple. He also instructs Sokka to follow her, and he does so. While they're then heading for the temple, a large rock almost falls on them, but Momo gets in the way. He gets injured in the process, but Yui says she can save him. She then takes him to the most sacred place in the north. After putting Momo inside the sacred water, he survives and becomes lively again. However, before Sokka and Yue can leave, Zhao arrives at the sacred spot with Iroh and some other men. Elsewhere, Kuruk appears to Aang and tells him that he has been getting a strange feeling that Zhao wants to harm the spirits controlling the water tribe. After Kuruk disappears, Aang tells Katara that they need to find Zhao and stop whatever plans he has. However, before they go too far, Zuko shows up and stops them. Katara then tells Aang to keep going while she fights Zuko. Meanwhile, Zhao has now spotted the ocean and moon spirits moving inside the sacred water as fishes. He identifies and traps the moon spirit inside a bag, causing the moon to turn red. Aang then arrives to join Sokka and Yui in begging Zhao to leave the spirit alone. Even though Iroh also tries to stop him, Zhao kills the moon spirit, and this makes everywhere go dark. All the waterbenders also lose their powers, and Aang feels disappointed because he has once again let the world down. He then decides to allow the ocean spirit to consume him and get the powers of the Avatar. Yue begs him not to do it, but he says it's the only thing he can do to help fight for the waterbenders. He eventually does it and comes out as a giant fish that starts killing many firebenders. Zhao manages to escape, and Iroh also goes to find Zuko. When they see each other, Iroh says they need to leave, but Zuko still wants Aang. However, Iroh says that Aang is now gone because he has given himself up to the ocean spirit. Zuko looks disappointed, but he agrees to leave with his uncle. Suddenly, Zuko sees Zhao and confronts him for ruining everything. Zhao looks shocked to see Zuko alive, but still tells him that Ozai has been playing a game between his kids to test them, and that the one who is winning is Azula. Zhao then mentions that Azula has been helping him all along. Despite being angry, Zuko spares Zhao, but as the commander tries to attack the prince, Iroh kills him. Zuko and Iroh then head away to get a boat to leave the city. Meanwhile, Aang continues to destroy the Fire Nation ships. Sokka then asks Yue if there's a way to save Aang and the waterbenders. She says there is, though she freezes his legs to the ground before mentioning that she can actually sacrifice herself since a part of the moon spirit is inside her. Sokka doesn't want her to do it, but she then enters the sacred water with the dead fish. Following this, she gives her life for the moon spirit. The moon then shows up again, and Katara begs Aang to return because the world still needs him. Shortly after, Aang leaves the ocean spirit and returns to the land. As the survivors clean up the city, Pakku invites Katara to become a waterbending master in the north. She thanks him for the offer, but mentions that she needs to stick with Aang and also teach him waterbending. Shortly after, Aang looks at the damaged city and blames himself for it. However, Sokka and Katara tell him that it's the Fire Nation's fault. They also tell him to stop thinking about when he couldn't save the world because he now has the chance to do it again. He agrees with them, and they also decide to head to Omashu so that Aang can learn earthbending, while Katara also teaches him waterbending. Elsewhere, Ozai learns about the failed mission in the north. However, he says it was expected. A priest then asks why he allowed the invasion, and he says it was a distraction. As he then looks happy, Azula is seen leading some troops into Omashu after successfully conquering the place. After she also gets Bumi arrested, she announces to the soldiers that they've taken over Omashu for the first time since the war started, and they all cheer for her.